Lloyd Austin, who's introduced, brought to us by Beryl Leatherland. Thank you, Beryl, for introducing us to each other. And Lloyd, thank you very much for coming to join us. It's, as you know, Europe and the environment and habitat directives and all that sort of thing were loomed very large in our lives until a year or two ago. And I just wonder what the situation is now and how you see the future going. Perhaps you give us a little bit of your own background first, say what your history is. That's interesting too, because I know you've been involved in this for a long time. And then maybe set the scene, and we'll have a bit of a discussion once you've set the scene. Welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you for Beryl for putting us in touch, and thank you for the invitation. To answer your question about who I am first, I worked for over 30 years for RSPB Scotland. I left that role as head of policy just over 2 years ago now, and that was partly semi-retirement, but it was equally an opportunity to go freelance and part-time, which I am now. And I do various bits of work providing environmental policy advice to a range of NGOs, in particular Scottish Environment Link, which is the umbrella body of NGOs in Scotland, where I'm the convener of their governance group, who have overseen the work they've done on Brexit over the last few years. The other thing I still do is I'm the UK board member of the European Environment Bureau, which is kind of the umbrella body of environmental NGOs across the whole of Europe. They obviously do an awful lot of work out on EU issues, but Europe to the EEB is the whole continent. So the UK is still an active member with 6 or 7 of the big NGOs in the UK who are members. Notwithstanding all of that, I'm just talking to you as myself tonight, so I'm not speaking on behalf of any of those organisations. It's just my personal reflections. And what I'm thinking of doing is trying to outline how environmental law and policy in Scotland in particular, but in the UK generally, has developed in relation to the EU, both pre and since Brexit, and how that has benefited us, what the problems have been, and what needs to be addressed in the future. So I was planning to maybe talk for about 15 minutes, possibly 20, I'll see how I go, and then open it up to questions and discussion. I think that you may have all heard this oft-quoted statistic before, but something like until Brexit, of course, something like 80% of environmental law in Scotland and the UK as a whole originated as EU law. And that probably reflects what I would call the international nature of the environment, in as much as most, if not all, environmental issues are international, they're cross-border. You know, all of the issues to do with air pollution, water pollution, migrating birds and animals, etc., all mean that there is benefit in addressing environmental issues multinationally. And some of the examples, John mentioned the Habitats Directive, but equally its sister Birds Directive, things like the Water Framework Directive, which was the successor to many of the water-related regulations that you'll have heard of on bathing beaches and urban wastewater, etc. Marine Strategy Framework Directive, lots of air quality issues. All of those were European law first before they were implemented in the UK and Scotland, either by direct effect or through implementing legislation. So EU environmental law was very comprehensive. It was very important to environmentalists. But I just wanted, before I go on, to sort of try and set that in a bit of context. And I've noted here 5 kind of contextual points that need to be considered when we then move on to think about the consequences of Brexit and the way ahead. The first thing is that the EU does have good environmental law, but on the other hand, it's also fairly average when you compare it to other countries or other multinational bodies. There is lots of environmental downsides with law and policy from the EU, most in particular the common agriculture policy, the common fisheries policy, its access to justice policies. Those are all negative impacts on the environment. And, you know, that makes the EU kind of typical in a way compared to other legal jurisdictions. It does, however, reflect many areas of global and regional environmental law that stem from UN conventions of one type or another. So, for instance, the Birds and Habitats Directives tends to try and reflect and implement the biodiversity agreements that were reached at the UN summit in Rio. Similarly, the access to justice policies reflect the Aarhus Convention, which is a UN convention. And the EU sometimes does better than the global requirements, the UN requirements. Sometimes it does it poorer. And that's very similar to other jurisdictions, whether countries, individual countries or multinational entities. There is, though, one very big positive that the EU has over other multinational bodies, and that is summed up in one word: enforcement. The way in which the institutions work with the Commission and the European Court of Justice means that member states can be held to account through judgments and fines, etc., for complying with environmental law. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's difficult to access. There are issues to do with the rules, but it's a system that means that there is the ability to enforce the multinational law that comes from the EU onto member states, which doesn't exist in many of the UN bodies. So, for instance, the Biodiversity Convention I mentioned, if a member body, a member country of the UN doesn't fulfill its obligations under that convention, there's nothing anybody can do other than try and simply embarrass that country politically within its own decision-making processes. And even those that have modest compliance provisions like Aarhus, it's simply a committee that gives a notice of non-compliance, and it's a diplomatic embarrassment to a member country, but there's nothing that can be done. And so the enforcement provisions within the EU was a key issue that we needed to consider when we come to what happens with Brexit, and I'll come back to that. My fourth contextual point is that over 40 years of membership, the UK was often one of the leading member states in developing and supporting environmental provisions. The Birds Directive, for instance, doesn't look too unlike, you maybe spot my geekiness here, it doesn't look too unlike the 1954 Protection of Birds Act. And that's because many of the UK officials who worked on developing the Birds Directive worked on in UK environmental policy. And of course, the rather well-known individual from the UK was instrumental in the development of the Habitats Directive. That was, of course, Stanley Johnson. No idea what happened to his family. More recently, both the UK and the Scottish Marine Acts were very much developed in parallel with the development of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, so that when the directive came into force, actually the UK was already complying, because it had developed its legislative provisions in parallel. So although that's all good about the UK's involvement, both the UK and the Scottish government actually were better at developing new ideas and supporting new ideas in Europe than they were actually implementing it at home. Despite the fact that many of the aspects of EU environmental law were UK ideas, when they came to implement it, they used to tell everybody that they're only doing it because the EU requires it. And so they tried to kind of shift the blame slightly. If there was a regulation that somebody didn't like, it was a nasty EU regulation, and yet it was one that they probably had a hand in developing, supporting, and voting for. And one does wonder whether that kind of approach did help contribute to various Eurosceptic attitudes. So more generally, in terms of implementation, both Scotland and the UK as a whole had a pretty mixed reputation mixed record when it came to implementation. It was sometimes good. It was sometimes did what was absolutely necessary to the letter. Sometimes it was poor. But in that regard, I think it was pretty average as a member state. I think there are a few that are 100% good. There are a few that are 100% poor. Most have examples of bad practice. Most also have examples of good practice. So whilst not perfect, environmental law from the EU was both important and a crucial aspect of environmental law and policy in the UK. So I now come to the events of 2016 and the referendum on Brexit. Obviously, given that context, it was a big challenge for environmental NGOs, not least because few wish to take a side. I suspect that this is partly an issue to do with not wanting to be too overtly political with a capital P, and particularly in England, as opposed to in Scotland, the Charity Commission and the Lobbying Act provisions mean that it's very difficult for charities sometimes to do things that can be interpreted as being political. But they did seek to raise the issues that I've been talking about and the need for environmental matters to be recognised. A few did speak out for Remain. Some produced very heavily caveated statements to say that insofar as the environment or nature was concerned, Remain suggested the best option. But most either kept quiet or simply kept saying, whatever the outcome, we want to see the best for the environment. Now, in hindsight, we can debate whether that was the right approach or not. But anyway, we ended up with the referendum result that we got. And NGOs then rather swiftly moved into a arrangement of trying to address the situation as we found it and to see whether, whatever form Brexit took, that the environmental issues were taken into account. And this was very much done as a partnership exercise. In Scotland, it was through Environmental Link, and in London at the UK level, it was done through a coalition called Greener UK. Many of the members of both those coalitions overlapped, RSPB, WWF, Friends of the Earth, and so forth. And collectively, we identified three big issues that needed to be addressed. The first was we said there had to be some form of EU-UK agreement that recognised the environment. The one thing we were able to do after the election, after the referendum, when it wasn't deemed to be as political, was to be able to say that quite vocally that no deal was not an option we could support. And in terms of that potential agreement at that time, we thought that there were two key asks. One was for the concept of non-regression to be noted. And in the end, we were successful in that. Non-regression exists in the environmental chapter of the agreement. It's relatively weak and it has unclear enforcement arrangements, but it's there. We also asked for ongoing alignment. And again, although it's not called ongoing alignment, because alignment is a dirty word for some members of the UK government and parliament, a form of alignment is included. They call it rebalancing, and it's a very weak and poor form of alignment, but that's actually what it is. It only relates to environmental law that can impact trade policy and trade matters. So it's limited, but I think many environmentalists think quite a lot of environmental law can affect trade matters. So we're going to have to see how that works out. I'm happy to talk more about the agreement in answer to any questions, but I'll move on to what I thought was the other issue, and that is what we described as the proper replication of the EU law and governance arrangements in domestic arrangements. So the issue of carrying over of EU law into domestic law was the first big thing that we argued for, and that was mainly achieved through the Withdrawal Act that created a new legal concept of retained EU law, which effectively meant that anything that was law as a result of being EU law became UK law, or law in the UK jurisdictions. It's a very blanket provision, but it's actually welcome. And in theory, it means that as a result of Brexit, nothing has changed. It's just simply carried over. Having said that, in practice, there are a number of complications. The first thing is that some law doesn't work because it mentions the Commission, or it refers, there are entities that are referenced that don't exist, etc. So there was a provision which was quite controversial at the time, the so-called Henry VIII powers, for government to be able to make amending regulations to kind of tidy up that retained EU law. And that became an incredible amount of detail in which there was a lot of devil, if you see what I mean, to try and sort through and work out what it meant, etc. And we're still doing it because there's still hundreds of potential statutory instruments to tidy things up. The second complication is, of course, that if nothing changes, that means that nothing changes until it changes. And is essentially the very fact that the whole concept of Brexit was to take back control means that that governments in the UK now have the power to change this retained EU law as they wish, rather than through negotiation through an EU process. And I'd flag up two potential environmental ones that are on the agenda. The first is the chemicals regulation called REACH, which the four governments of the UK are jointly consulting on a replacement for that at the moment, which proposes a far weaker and slimmer regime than the European one. I'll leave you to think about why the Scottish government have signed up to such a consultation when, as we'll see later, they're also committed to keeping pace with Europe. And the second example I quote is the Habitats Directive, where the UK government announced yesterday that they were going to review the habitats regulations in England. They can only do that for England. Whether the other devolved administrations will follow, we'll wait and see. But they're already looking at what changes they can make. The second issue we were concerned about was the underpinning environmental principles that guide law and policy. These weren't part of retained EU law because they were in the treaty. They weren't in directives or regulations. And we were very pleased that in the end, all our governments did recognize that. And we now have the 4 environmental principles plus the principle of integration included in the UK Environment Bill for England and Northern Ireland, the Continuity Act for Scotland, and Wales is committed to legislate on those matters post-election. So that's an issue where I think the problem was recognised and we've won the case and it's been addressed relatively well. The third issue, you'll recall I mentioned that the big positive of the EU arrangements was the issue of enforcement. So we argued for some way of replicating the role of the Commission and the Court of Justice in ensuring that law is complied with. And that has been, I would say, partly secured, both by the UK Environment Bill and the Continuity Act in Scotland, through the formation of a so-called independent regulatory body, the Office of Environmental Protection for England and Northern Ireland and Environmental Standards Scotland, which will come into being during this summer. And Wales has a commitment, again, in its post-election period to create a similar thing. And those bodies are empowered to take governments to court domestically if they feel that they're not complying with environmental law. So there are limitations and problems and challenges with that, and there are many ways in which we'd like to see them do better. But in terms of the big picture, we've made some progress. So overall, I think NGOs in the various coalitions in which they operated have engaged in considerable lobbying of parliaments and governments, both at UK and Scottish levels, and have secured the recognition that the environment is a big issue in terms of addressing the consequences of Brexit. We've secured considerable mitigations in terms of replacements or replications of the EU arrangements. We haven't achieved everything we hoped for. There's still much to do, and what is in place has yet to be tested, so we'll see how it goes. And I'd just conclude really by saying that whilst, as I said, the EU law and the EU arrangements were good, they were never perfect. And even if Brexit never happened, there were still improvements in domestic arrangements that were needed. So we continue to press those improvements, as well as pressing for other improvements to the post-Brexit arrangements if they prove to be not as good as hoped for. I think things that are very much on the agenda for the Scottish Government in the next this session of Scottish Parliament is the consideration of environmental court within the Scottish justice system, and also the human right to a healthy environment, which is very big on the UN agenda at the moment, and which the Scottish Human Rights Task Force has recommended to government should be put into Scottish legislation. And so those are things that we're hoping for in the coming years, which would help further mitigate the impact of Brexit, but would actually have been good even if we were still in the EU. And finally, as I mentioned about my role in the EEB, we continue to engage with the EU and will continue to do so because it's still influential globally, and it's still, whether Brexiteers like it or not, still going to influence this small island off the northwest coast of the continent. Thank you very much, and very happy to answer any questions.
Got to unmute myself. Lloyd, thank you very much. It's very, very useful start to our discussion, I think, very interesting. Just generally, do you get the feel, I mean, we've got this, the government talking about it, in England anyway, about its agricultural policy is very environmental, elms or whatever that is. There's a, Boris's father, you mentioned Stanley, who happened, was a colleague of mine in the first parliament. We were together, and I knew him well with his work on seal killing in St. Lawrence and all these sort of things. But anyway, is there a general, and I think the Scottish government is pretty environmentally oriented. I mean, is there a general atmosphere in political circles pro-environment, or are you battling all your time when it comes to things like agriculture and fisheries and coal and steel and all these other things? Are you up against it, or are you actually got a favourable wind politically at the moment?
I think it's very much a mixed picture, and it's not a mixed picture based on Scotland versus the UK or one political party versus the other political party. It seems to come and go, almost depending on a personality of ministers and others, but equally, I think no government claims to be anti-environment. They all claim to be pro-government, pro-environment. They all claim to be world leading, and they all fall short. I think in terms of agriculture, I think the UK-England situation was that they went very pro-environment during Michael Gove's period of environment minister at DEFRA, and now they've gone backwards almost as fast as he took them forward. So within the same political party in control, they've swung one way or another. In Scotland, they have a mixed approach in as far as they are very supportive of the farming industry, and in some parts of Scotland and in some parts of Scottish agriculture, particularly crofting and the islands, and for instance, that is very environmentally friendly for agriculture, and it's a good form of agriculture to defend and support. However, that also means that they support the damaging forms of agriculture and the sort of agribusiness type efforts and so forth. And they have, in a sense, tried to stick to their anti-Brexit goals by saying we're not going to change anything as much as unless the UK government forces us to. And that's actually meaning that they're accepting the bad things that come from Europe rather than the good things. So I think it's a very mixed picture, north and south of the border. Sorry, you're muted, John.
I'm being a good boy and muting myself every time I go off. Anybody would have a question they'd like to put to Lloyd? Yes, Joe, put up your hands. I can't see everybody because some of you are off my screen. There's too many of you, but yes. Okay, Joe, I saw you.
Evening, Lloyd. Thank you very much. I think that was a really very concise, excellent summary for us all to sort of get a feel of where we are. And we're just so grateful that the NGOs did such a good job of trying to influence the process. My background is working in the council secretariat, and I followed all the AIR files, so I sort of know where you're coming from. And in our local groups forum, where all of these groups under the umbrella European movement get together, we drafted some sort of information papers in each of the policy areas that we felt were sort of most important in terms of Brexit, or sort of had most European influence in them, and sent them to all the parties and candidates before the election, because we came up with some bullet points that we really wanted the new Scottish government to do. Now, I didn't actually draft the environment one because we have a very good colleague in Perth who works for SEPA, who had some quite interesting points to make. But one of the things we feel it's really important that the Scottish government attempts to do, as well as obviously continuing to enforce the acquis as they were when we left, is also to try to keep up with new environmental legislation that is passed before we hopefully get ourselves back into Europe. But another point that was made, which I think is interesting, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, having sat myself for many, many, many long hours in the Environment Working Party, there are extremes in the cross-section of member states in terms of their reactions to making environmental legislation. There are the Green Bloc, there are the verging towards the Black Bloc, and then there's the people in the middle who try to help find something that's perhaps not as far as the Scandies and some of the other member states would like to take environmental legislation. They maybe already have more stringent measures in place. But the point that Susanna was making is that sometimes there are bits of legislation which, for the exact situation in Scotland, maybe do go too far. And I'm not sure exactly of the example she was meaning, but what she suggested was that some of the wastewater implementation requires really over-the-top extra measures to be taken, which could actually, in somewhere like the Outer Hebrides, where any wastewater is going to be whisked off miles away into the Atlantic, and to fulfill the European requirements could actually almost be more environmentally damaging. And that it would be perhaps a very useful role for Scotland to fulfill, to try to, where what was enforceable European legislation was perhaps a bit over the top for some particular environmental situations in Scotland, we could give a very good example of how to make minor exceptions work really well and better for certain parts of the environment, and that would be a very useful thing for us to share with Europe, and one of the ways that we should be keeping well in touch through environmental networks with other member states. And I just wondered if the NGOs have sort of given that much thought.
Okay, thanks. I think there's kind of three questions there in a sense. I'll try and deal with them each in turn. In terms of Scottish Government policy going forward, the Scottish Government's rhetoric is very good, in as much as they say they want to keep aligned with Europe as much as they can. It contrasts with the UK government in that regard, which is almost looking for things to change for the sake of changing. They haven't quite said that, but they are doing that in some issues. The Scottish government has passed in the Continuity Act a thing that's known as the keeping pace power, that gives ministers the power to make regulations to keep Scottish law aligned with EU law when they think it's appropriate. We've yet to see them actually use that power. I mean, not least because they only passed the Continuity Act about Christmas, and they went nearly straight into the election. So it's the new Scottish government that's got to deal with it. And the first thing they've got going to do is they're going to produce a policy statement on how they intend to use it. And that will be in the course of this summer. And I think that will be a very important document for everyone, not least environmental NGOs, to try and influence. And you may want to keep an eye on that in relation to non-environmental matters as well. But that will guide Scottish ministers in the use of their keeping pace power under the Continuity Act. So I would certainly keep an eye out for that, and we certainly will from the NGO side. We will argue that they should keep pace as much as possible with environmental matters. On your observations about the EU, I would fully agree. In relation to my work with the EEB, we find that on different issues, there are different countries that you might call the angels, and there are different countries which are the devils. And on different issues, it's a different group of countries. On climate change and coal mining, for instance, it's probably Poland and Hungary are the problem. You kind of said all the Scandi ones were in the good camp. They often are, but just in the last few months, they've been in a bad camp when it comes to climate change and biomass. Their forest industries are very effective, and apparently in Scandinavia, burning trees is a good thing to do for the climate, which seems odd to environmentalists. So those countries have got a very, I would give a mixed record to virtually every member state. I think but I do think that the process of the EU, it has been one that has been a good way of ensuring, in a sense, that although there are different alliances at different times, progress is made across the piece, and that laggards are brought up to held to account, and the ones that lead on different issues can lead. And that comes on to, I think, your last point, and also one of the fundamental things about EU law is that it's always a floor, it's never a ceiling. In environmental standards, member states have always been able to do better than is required under EU law. Some do, some don't. But, I mean, there are plenty of things in domestic Scottish or UK environmental law which were not required by Europe. There are lots of wildlife species that are protected in the UK that are not rare across Europe, but we've decided to protect them just because we think it's the right thing to do, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing to do. And other countries likewise do things that are important to them, that are good. However, where the EU has agreed a floor, we think it's important that all the countries stick to that and stick to the minimum standards that are required. And whilst every country squeals that this is too far or too over the top, etc., for their special circumstance, as environmentalists, I tend to be very skeptical of such squeals, especially when they come from the so-called regulator like SEPA, who, they're supposed to make sure that industry and landowners stick to the law, not voice the industry's concerns. But anyway, that's me having a bit of an NGO rant. Sorry about that. But all the EU laws do have provisions for derogations. So all member states have the ability in certain circumstances to make the case to the Commission and, if necessary, the court, that there are local circumstances or important issues of national interest that means that they should be allowed a derogation. And, your example from the Western Isles may have some merit in it. But I think one of the things that UK tended to do, it tended to always do things by the letter rather than by trying to achieve the spirit of the law, because our courts, our domestic courts, are much more, look at things by interpreting the letter of the law rather than the purpose of the law. I mean, it's often said by lawyers that European courts interpret more purposefully than UK courts. Now, I know a wee bit about that, but it's an interesting aspect of things that we tend to, in a sense, transpose things by the letter rather than trying to achieve the outcome. But that's by the by. I mean, I think there are opportunities for flexibility that are sometimes not picked up. Sometimes such flexibility isn't justified. Sometimes it could be and could be more used.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Margaret, did I see your hand up before? Margaret Caldwell, is that right? No? Anyone else would like?
No, thanks, no.
No, it wasn't you? Okay, beg your pardon. Well, I was going to ask...
Sorry.
Sorry.
I can see Paul has his hand up.
Oh, have you? Okay, well done. Sorry if you.
Yes, can I come in here?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much for your fascinating introduction. You mentioned in passing the CAP fisheries policy, and that links up in my mind with trade agreements, which have been very much in the air recently. Obviously, the one with Australia, and in the longer term, an agreement with the United States. What are your views on this development? Is it potentially hazardous to the environment?
Potentially. The other thing I mentioned in passing is that the agreement has this provision about rebalancing, which means that they're only required to rebalance environmental matters where it affects trade. And I think in passing, I mentioned that environmentalists think that quite a lot of things can affect trade, and therefore we will interpret that quite broadly. And for that reason, I think that the potential trade agreements or the liberalisation of trade without the various caveats that the EU trade agreements have could potentially be a risk to the environment. I mean, it could be to the environment. I mean, the things that have grabbed the headlines, of course, have been human health issues like chlorinated chicken and antibiotics in meat and so forth. But, you know, one of the things is that if we import particularly food products that have been produced either through farming or fishing or aquaculture, etc., by methods that don't require the producers to comply with environmental standards that our producers have. You know, I mean, I was answering John's question about the environmental aspects of agriculture policy in the UK, and you know, our farmers are actually and fish farmers have quite a lot of environmental hurdles to jump. We think that's right that they should, and they do. And when they do it, they should be rewarded for it. Like I mentioned with the sustainable types of farming that are associated with crofting areas, for instance. But if those farmers are effectively outcompeted by farmers in Australia or North America who don't have to have those environmental hurdles, then I think that is a problem for the environment, because immediately there will be pressure within the UK and within Scotland to remove those environmental hurdles on our farming in order to allow our farmers and other food producers to compete. And that's why we, particularly as Greener UK, because trade is very much a reserve matter and it's the UK government that leads on it. As Greener UK, we have produced quite a lot of briefings for MPs and do quite a lot of lobbying of the UK government to try and influence these trade processes to ensure that environmental matters are covered. And I must be completely complimentary to them. The various farmers' unions and others have worked very closely with us. We've done some joint working with the NFU in England, the NFUS in Scotland, and other farming bodies on these trade matters. You know, we vehemently disagree about lots of domestic things, but when it comes to trade, we're on the same side solidly and working together. I mean, I think we can say that we have allies in DEFRA, but people in the Department for International Trade who don't agree with us or DEFRA. And the reports over the weekend that you mentioned about the Australia deal is just a classic example of the fact that the UK government itself is divided on that question.
Yeah, I was gonna,
thank you for that. But in particular, Liz Truss and her attitude, does that give you any confidence?
No, The Department of International Trade has been very difficult for us and even the National Farmers Union to get to speak to anyone.
They're very secretive, aren't they? But I was going to actually take that one a little bit further. Is it, if we're too environmental, are we not just exporting it to other places? For example, if we cut down on our beef production because of to reduce methane or whatever else, we then start importing from Brazil, and Brazil cuts down more rainforest. You know, how do you get the balance right globally? I mean, really, in the end.
Well, that's a whole bigger question about the same kind of problems arise as a result of that. Assumes you have the same consumption. If we cut down on beef production but keep our consumption the same, then we do export the problem. If we cut down on our production but equally cut down on our consumption, we don't export the problem. And you know, I think the climate scientists and others will say that consumption is more of a problem than production methods. Production methods are obviously important, and actually it's about the aggregate consumption across the globe that is the real problem. And that doesn't mean that you should reduce consumption of any particular thing to zero, although I would argue that over the next, before 2050, you probably do need to get the consumption of coal down to zero and oil and gas to nearly zero. But other consumption matters, you probably just need to get them more in line with the sustainability of the globe to be able to renew the resource that you're exploiting, if you see what I mean. You're muted again.
Sorry. Yeah, you then have an increasing population and a population who wants improving standards and move from eating rice to eating meat and so on. It's a quandary, isn't it?
It is a quandary, and I'll give a plug here. The EEB have a seminar on population issues in June. Anybody from an NGO who's interested is welcome to that. The issue on population is right, but it's again, it's the per capita consumption that's the issue. And as you say, in the developing world where people move from you know, sustainable or even what you might call what's the word, you know, very poor diets and subsistence farming, etc. When they have a perfectly realistic, a perfectly understandable ambition to move more towards the middle class affluence of the developed world, that involves far greater consumption. So the issue is, how do we equalize the well-being of people without necessarily equalizing consumption? And where we do equalize consumption, we need to be able to allow an increase in some parts of the world by having a more significant decrease in other parts of the world. One of the things about population growth is that it's actually no longer exponential. Population growth is actually stabilizing almost naturally as a result of development, women's empowerment, education, etc. And you can see that by comparing different countries, and there's quite a lot of UN work on that. The question is, as population stabilizes, how do you ensure the right balance between young people and retired people, etc.?
Lloyd, have you got a link to that EEB seminar you just mentioned?
Not offhand, but it's a seminar for members. So
Right.
I'm just highlighting it as something that is a topical issue within the environmental NGOs. Beryl would be welcome as a link member.
Beryl,
I'll quiz her.
you can listen in.
Yeah, could I say yes, I get some really interesting newsletters and articles from the EEB. I appreciate them greatly, and it does help to keep me up to date with what's happening in Europe and, you know, current thinking. One of the things also about beef production is the crofters and so on. The cattle there are grass fed and fed efficiently and sustainably, whereas cattle in North America are fed on grain largely, and that's a less efficient method of production. There's more energy wastage. I'm not sure about Australia, but considering their problems with growing crops and drought and all sorts of things, I would doubt, it's difficult to say, but I would doubt that their cattle, despite having such big farms, could possibly be produced as efficiently as a crofter in the Outer Hebrides produces his beef. The Outer Hebrides beef would taste a lot better as well.
Any other questions? Yes, Bill, is it Bill? Yes, Bill.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Lloyd. I think if nothing else, you've proven to us what an enormous subject environment is. It's and I do worry slightly that we treat it as one subject when in fact you've demonstrated it's at least 20. And just before I go on, I mean, just one observation. I don't claim to be an expert here, but my understanding was that Scottish law was more outcome focused, relatively speaking, than English law. English law was, because it's based much more on precedent, was much more about the letter of the law. So maybe that's a glimmer of hope that we might seek to follow up in terms of outcome-based legislation. I was interested in this kind of bigger picture, because one of the things you mentioned earlier on was the effect of, or the contribution rather, that the UK delegation had made to the development of EU environment law. A very positive contribution that had made to that. And I guess, therefore, there is a risk that no longer having that presence, there is a risk that the European environment law goes backwards. Now, there are some, sadly, in this country who would see that as a triumph, because it demonstrates that Britain's got better laws. But sadly, of course, they would be wrong, because we all live in the same environment, and the problems will come over the sea or whatever. So is there a risk there, or well, there is obviously a risk, but what's the position there? How do you see that through the work that you're doing with the EEB? Are you able to hold the line, or has that position been weakened in any way? And I think really that was, so it's partly about how the UK influence in terms of the total environmental agenda, and how that's factored into things like international agreements is taken into account. But it's also partly about our big next door neighbour in Europe.
Yeah, just on your preliminary point, obviously you're right about Scots law and English law being different, and England being much more focused on precedent. I think Scots law, though, is very much based on interpreting the letter of the statute. They just don't like purposes. I've been in the quarter session when I've had recitals from the directives, which is the purpose, read out, and the Lord President and others go to sleep. They just don't like it. They look at what is the duty on a public body, and that is the one thing that they will interpret. They don't do it via precedent in the way that England does, but they do interpret the letter to the letter. And but anyway, however, having said that, we were successful in getting a purpose into the Continuity Act in regard to the keeping pace powers. So the keeping pace power now has a purpose in a Scottish Act of the Scottish Parliament, which is actually one of the first times that's ever happened. And the purpose of keeping pace is to allow the Scottish government to align, and it says what it's supposed to align with. Environmental standards is one of them, but so is social protection and human rights and other things. And I will be fascinated to see how that purpose clause gets interpreted if there's ever a court case about that, because I think that is a really positive precedent that we were able to sell to the Scottish Parliament within the Continuity Act. And I have to say that was done not just in partnership between NGOs through Link, but Link itself then went into partnership with a group called the Human Rights Consortium that includes the children's rights groups and the elderly people's rights groups and so forth. So, you know, it was a very much across the social and environmental sectors that argued for that. In terms of your second question, I think I would have to say the jury is out. The UK was good in pushing forward and helping develop EU environmental law during its 40 years in place, but it wasn't always good. It sometimes was a laggard, as I described the variation between member states. I think it really will depend on how the EU develops without the UK there. I mean, as Joe described earlier, there are different groups of countries with different political and environmental outlooks. Whilst every country has examples of where it's bad and every country has examples of where it's good, it will, I think it will, there are good things happening in Europe still. The climate law that they've just passed is good. The biodiversity strategy that they've just published is good. But the issue about the burning forests has been a problem. The move to reform the CAP has been completely stymied by the two big political blocs in the Parliament, both the Conservative equivalent, the EPP, and the Labour equivalent, the Socialists. They've both blocked reform of the CAP. So it's a mixed picture, and I don't know. I think a lot will depend on whether or not the EU and the UK move to a grown-up position and work together in international fields. So I think Glasgow, the COP26 in Glasgow, might be an interesting case study in that, because on paper, the UK and the EU's positions are the same. They both want net zero by 2050. They've both got fairly good interim targets for 2030 and 2040. Let's see whether they work together or whether they try and outcompete each other as being the best, or the best to push for success, or the best at blocking progress. They may have their heads knocked together metaphorically by John Kerry with a bit of luck.
I do worry when we look across the Atlantic for environmental advice.
Well, I agree with you on a lot of issues, but on COP26, because Biden has rejoined in the last 6 months, things have moved very fast, and John Kerry, as his special envoy, is actually doing a tremendous amount of good work going around the world, getting people lined up for COP26. He's doing that, which actually I think the UK as the president should be doing and isn't.
Yeah, agree with that.
I get the impression there is a bit of a feeling in London that we've always got to be different from the EU if we possibly can. If we can find a different, we'll make it, and we'll distance ourselves as much as we can. We don't want to look to be too close. Is that a sentiment? Maybe we'll grow up and grow out of that after a bit of adulthood comes in, but that seems to be the tendency at the moment. Yeah. Elizabeth Slater, did I see your hand up? Were you wanting? Maybe you were just changing your screen or something, but no. Okay, anybody else, or should we let Lloyd off the hook? Lloyd, I think that's been fascinating, and I think we'll probably have to come back to you again periodically just to see how things are developing, because it's going to be an ongoing issue, obviously, and I think you've got your work cut out for a long time to come, and we'll very much enjoy coming back to you periodically, maybe just to see how things are progressing. So thank you very, very much for helping us.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed meeting you all. Obviously, I've known Beryl for a while, but nice to meet all the rest of you. And I'll disappear and leave you to your rest of the meeting. But good luck with everything else.
Yeah, Lloyd, just before you totally disappear, you know, we do have this network of groups who are all sort of a bit looking for tasks now, and we've got quite a good outreach systems as well. So if you ever think there's anything useful that we can be doing on engaging our membership in to support the work of the environmental NGOs, please do think of letting us know.
Well, local groups.
Thanks, Joe, and we will bear that in mind. The one thing that I would repeat again is do look out for this keeping pace consultation in the summer, and you know, any contacts you have with MSPs who are going to have to sign off that keeping pace policy statement, you know, the more you can warn them that that's what they're going to have to do, and encourage them to sign off the strongest possible keeping pace policy statement that they can get. That would be grand.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.